Call to order the meeting of the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee for April 25th, 2022. Our first order of business tonight is approval of the agenda. You will notice that our agenda still lists that we have to have roll call votes. So we do not need to have roll call votes because we are all here in person. So we will amend that part of the agenda. With that, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda.
Motion by Councilmember Sterner. Is there a second?
Second by Chambliss.
Seconded by Councilmember Chambliss. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. And the agenda is approved. And we've officially accomplished our first order of business at our first in-person meeting. So we're going to take that as our small victory for tonight. All right, the next thing is approval of the agenda, or of the minutes for the April 11th, 2022 Transportation Committee meeting. Did anyone have any changes or additions? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Cummings moves approval.
It's moved by Councilmember Cummings. Is there a second?
Zarin seconds.
Seconded by Councilmember Zarin. Is there any other discussion? All right, seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. And the minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda is employee recognition. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Kinderis.
All right. Thank you, Chair Barber. Well, today, Metro Transit is excited to present 4 representatives from the Bus Transportation Division whose actions truly deserve to be recognized. As you'll hear in a moment, each of their stories is unique, but what they share is a dedication to Metro Transit and to carrying out our mission, especially in even the most challenging of circumstances. I also wanted to note that General Manager Koistra is sad that he's missing recognition today, especially since it's our first in-person recognition in a couple of years. So I wanted to pass along his thanks and congratulations as well. But now I'm going to hand it over to Chief Operating Officer Brian Funk. Brian will say a few words about each person we're honoring today, and then Chair Barber will join Brian in handing out certificates. So, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Leslie. And Madam Chair, committee members, it's a pleasure to be here in person again, and I think what a great way to kick off resumption of in-person Transportation Committee meetings. I have the honor today to introduce you to 4 of our team members who each in their own right have had extraordinary efforts that have been recognized recently and more than anything are being recognized today in person. And so as I sort of go into each of the stories, if folks want to come up this direction, and then as Leslie said, we'll gather, take pictures with the certificates in just a moment. And so first is a team, Joanne and Thomas, if you want to stand up, operator and transit supervisor, who made a dynamic duo during an event which a customer who was being unruly refused to exit the bus. And Joanne, who was our operator, followed her training, calmly used the silent alarm, and summoned police to come to the scene without further incident. However, you know, there were other customers on board, and of course, as an operator, that can be very affecting. Supervisor Thomas, you guys can come on over, who is a former bus operator, stepped in, talked to our customers, and assured people that, you know, that things were going to be taken care of and that it was going to be okay. And so after going back to the garage with Joanne, Thomas stayed with her for more than an hour. He was described as a gift from heaven by Joanne for his support. And so Thomas has been at Metro Transit for about 9 years as a graduate of our Leadership Academy Employee Development Program. Joanne's a former educator, has been an operator with us since 2018. She's working on completing a dissertation and can soon be known as Dr. Driver. And she came to me not that long ago and asked how she could contribute more. And so, you know, despite being somewhat early in her career, she's stepped up and started to serve as a mentor for other employees, which is a fantastic contribution for people coming on board. Which transitions me next to Alec Johnson, if you want to come up here. Alec, for the last 6 years, has been really the workings behind our bus operator apprenticeship program. Many years ago, he partnered with Dan Stauffer, our manager of training, and Christine Kennan, who was in administration at the time, and worked at a federal level to establish what has become our bus operator apprenticeship program. More than that, he's really led the effort, especially the last couple of years during COVID, when it would have been really easy to sort of pack up and bunker, hunker down and not do a whole lot when it comes to building those relationships, and found ways, overcoming social distancing, masking, leaves of absence, concerns for health, atypical schedules, workforce shortages, to continue to move forward those program elements. And of course, nobody can do it alone, but he's the leader. He deserves this special recognition, and he's assembled a great team to ensure that we're able to keep this program moving forward. Now more than ever, a program like that for our newest employees is essential, especially our bus operators who are challenged day in and day out with some tough conditions out on the road, and then having that friend to go back and trusted voice back at the garage or off-duty hours is really critical, and Alec has done just a fantastic job of keeping that going. And then finally, we'll invite up our fourth guest, who has been a leader for us for more than 40 years. Operator Rodney Smith from South Garage recently achieved a milestone in his career with 42 years of safe driving. To our knowledge, he's just the second operator to reach this milestone. It's absolutely phenomenal. The millions of miles traveled, the number of people that he's interacted with, the lives that have been improved on a daily basis safely, which is the hallmark of what we do, really is immeasurable. And so it's something that everybody who comes into this, bus operator job, something, I did way back, I would not be able to get to that milestone. And so that effort, block after block, day after day, year after year, is something that we felt was more than deserving of recognition today. And so just want to hopefully join me in congratulating 4 individuals for their fantastic contributions. John, you guys should line up over there. That would be great. Thank you. One more for me. All right.
Thank you all. Thank you all. It's very fun to do that in person again, so thank you. Now we're on to the rest of our business. Our first item of reports is MTS Director Carlson. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The regional solicitation is one of the largest programs that we operate in MTS. The solicitation for federal funds application period closed last Thursday. High demand continues in this program. The council received a record number of applications, or 155 applications. The amount of money available is about $200 million, and that will be only about a third of the requests will be filled. So about $600 million was requested from those 155 applications. So if we could fund everything, including the local match, we'd be looking at $1.2 billion of transportation investments in the region. One thing I'll note is that demand for multi-use trails, bike and pedestrian trails, remains high, with 69 applications seeking $170 million. So it's a very popular program. Unfortunately, there's traditionally only around $30 million within that category against $170 million requested. So there is a need for that, and this regional solicitation is one of the only competitive programs for bike and ped application in the region. So we'll continue to evaluate the applications, and then ultimately it's toward the end of the year that TAB will select which projects are funded. On the finance side, I have a brief update on the motor vehicle sales tax receipts. So March 2022 receipts were consistent with March 2021, around $32 million to the council for the month. For the last 6 months, we exceed last year by about 5.5%, so we're continuing to see growth in MVest. And so far in 2022, we've received about $82 million total, which is $3.2 million or about 4% above forecast, so tracking well. And then on our contracted services, ridership continues to grow across MTS services. Metro mobility is about 80% now of pre-pandemic ridership, and Transit Link service continues to grow. February wage increases that we enacted, that we've discussed before, have helped in meeting contractor hiring of drivers. So we're able to meet that demand, and we're budgeted across the year to meet this demand as well. So we're continuing to step up as ridership grows. And then finally, like Metro Transit, MTS has adjusted following the end of the TSA order requiring face coverings on transit. Leslie will cover this topic in more detail, and we could jointly address any questions on that topic. But on any of my other report items or anything else, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Charles. Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Charles, I'm wondering, how does the MVest revenue compare to pre-COVID?
Great question, Madam Chair. Councilmember Cummings, I'd actually have to double check on that and get back to you, but I think it's continuing to rebound. Believe there was a dip, but continuing to bounce back. Not sure if we're above or below, but certainly continuing to grow ahead of 2021.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Director Carlson? And we'll welcome him. He joined us when we were still in virtual meetings, so welcome to the committee. Next, we turn over to the Metro Transit report, and we have Chief of Staff Leslie Kandaris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I first want to begin by acknowledging the really tragic news that you've probably heard by this point, but early Sunday morning, a person was stabbed to death on a Metro Transit bus. Certainly, everyone at Metro Transit extends our condolences and sympathies to the victims' loved ones. And our thoughts are also very much with the operator who was driving the bus at the time, the Metro Transit Police Department officers who responded, and the other riders who were on board during that time as well. Minneapolis Police Department is the lead law enforcement agency for this, and their homicide investigators are actively investigating, and it is an ongoing investigation. So very, very sad time. And now I have to switch gears entirely to where Charles left off with the mask mandate. As Director Carlson mentioned, last Monday, the federal court decision led the federal mask mandate that was in effect for public transportation to be suspended, or it is no longer in effect. Metro Transit has not issued our own mandate for our agency, and thus masks are voluntary at this time. We are not enforcing a mandate. But that being said, we are actively reiterating and amplifying CDC guidance that masks should still be worn on public transit. And we are reminding passengers that they shouldn't be riding if they're feeling ill, and they should try to keep distance from others whenever it's possible. I'll also note that we continue to provide masks on board as well, and we'll continue doing that for the foreseeable future. And then finally, on a separate topic, it's spring, and that comes with a construction season for Better Bus Stops. And this year, our Better Bus Stops program plans to add up to 20 new shelters, replace up to 25 aged shelters, and construct up to 40 accessible boarding pads at bus stops without shelters. And just to put those figures into context, 2022 is the second year of the program's current 5-year plan. And this year's capital projects will put our progress at 25% of the 5-year goal for new shelters, 50% of the goal for replacement shelters, 40% of the goal for light or heat at shelters, and about 40% of the goal for accessible boarding pads. So it's a significant investment that very much moves us forward with our Better Bus Stop goals. And since the program began, we've installed 181 new shelters and have added light or heat to 111 shelters. So part of why I wanted to mention this today is, as we do annually, we also send out letters to city council members to let them know about the Better Bus Stops construction in their area, and we anticipate sending those out by the end of this week to city council members in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So with that, Madam Chair, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Leslie. Are there any questions for Chief of Staff Canderas? All right, thank you. Next, we're on to our tab report, and we have Mr. Dugan. Welcome, Peter.
Oh, welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair. Wow, it's great to see everybody. Wow, 2 years, about 20 pounds. No, that's for me, anyway. Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Chair, Chambliss, honorable members of the committee. And if I'm not out of line, I'd like to welcome Councilmember Pacheco. We have I fumbled a little bit. It was 2016 when we met, but we'll connect on that. And of course, Director Carlson, Chief of Staff Canderas, and Jenna, thank you for behind the scenes. But I also know that Deputy General Manager Thompson is here, and of course, Chief Operating Officer Frank. So I want to acknowledge them. For MnDOT, the new construction season for 2022 projects are on the MnDOT website. There are a few carryover projects from 2021, including the 3rd Avenue Bridge in downtown Minneapolis, which is Councilmember Lilligren's district. And then in Councilmember Fredson's district, the 9435W concrete work. In case your constituents ask, sir, the lane closures began on April 18th from Marion to 35E. And then downtown again is the reconstruction of the I-35W stormwater system, which prevents flooding in the area in a heavy rain. From the MPCA, the focus now is on the VW settlement grants for heavy-duty off-road vehicles and equipment in the spring, electric vehicle charging stations in public, and multi-unit situations later on in 2022, and diesel in 22-23. MAC, a great increase. 31,000 people went through security in March, of course, at spring break. April 2020, 1,000 cars in the parking lot. April 22, 17,000 cars in the parking lot. So, and of course, as it was just mentioned by the Chief of Staff, the mask mandate was lifted on April 18th, but the Air Council International, which MSP is a member, is petitioning the CDC for relaxation of other mandates on domestic and most international flights. And it's important to note, and Mac made this very clear, that the TSA non-enforcement mandate does not preclude an individual transit operator from requiring masks. And lastly, the MSP and the MAC is very proud that the FAA has approved their noise reduction program among the toughest in the country for the protection of homes near the airport. And we have a new report that Chair Barber is aware of, is the Suburban Transit Authority report. And without going into a lot of detail, there's a lot of numbers, but to echo Director Carlson's comments, most of the ridership is way back up, particularly on the express, but also primarily on what they call the micro-connect, the mobility, all the little buses that connect people and take them where they really need to go on a call. On the agenda item, on your agenda, you notice that the first 5 items are consent for streamlined tip amendments. And if I may, as you will recall, the streamlined tip amendment is used when the request meets the following criteria. It's in line with the TPP of the Transportation Policy Plan. It's not regionally significant and does not require a scope change. Conversely, this doesn't come up too much, but a project is considered regionally significant if it focuses on regional transportation needs, such as getting to and from the area, centers such as major planned development, malls, sports complexes, or transportation hubs. It also includes, and I was schooling myself on this today, when a manufacturer adds at least 50 new jobs, agriculture 20 new jobs, financial institution 300 new jobs, and an R&D firm of any kind, but all must make a substantial and significant capital investments in the state. The first item is the Minneapolis Safety Project cost. The Minneapolis Safety Project was a direct result of projected cost increases to steel, concrete, and signals. A portion of the project is in Councilmember Cummings' district and Mr. Pacheco's district on Lake Street and Dean Parkway. The second is the Southwest LRT Green Line extension. The item, I know you know so much about this, but it's just $50 million of federal money is being added, whilst certain, about 28 million of Section 5307 funds are being reallocated. And again, I hope I'm not boring you, but 5307 refers to the CFR regulation, are those funds that are provided directly from the federal government, the FTA, I believe. Mr. Barbeau will correct me if I'm wrong. And it's formal, directly to transit operator, and its formal name is Urbanized Area Formula Grants. Whew, okay. And then in Vice Chair Chandler's district, there needs to be increase in the total and federal cost of the 169 cable median barriers between Brooklyn Park and Champlin. And in the Chair's district, Trunk Highway 5, between Chanhassen and Victoria, there is preliminary engineering. There were two other, and if, again, I'm going to follow up on Mr. Director Carlson, a breakdown of the regional applications. There is 4 modal categories in general: roadways, transit, bike ped, unique. 4, I'm sorry, I said 5. Applications in roadways, 61 for almost 650 million. Transit, 21 for 217. Bike ped, a big increase, 69 to 243. And unique projects, which is going to be the first year we're doing this, 4, but a total of 6.9 million. Okay, and they're coming, just so, again, for your constituents, they're coming from the unique applicants. There were 45 of them. The counties, there were 7 counties applied, 27 cities, 2 park districts, 3 transit providers, 4 nonprofit, 1 MnDOT, and 1 Met Council. And lastly, we had a talk from the FHWA, an expert on traffic safety named Mark Doctor, and it was if you get a chance to watch, it was really quite a presentation, but it's importing a system from Sweden, Denmark, and I think the Netherlands, where it's asked to be a paradigm shift. That we're not looking at safety as just cutting down on speed or crosswalks or things, but that it's based upon these 5 principles that, death and serious injury we can't have. But humans make mistakes, and we have to account for that. Humans are vulnerable. Obviously, if you're in a car, you're safer than if you're hit as a pedestrian. The responsibility is shared by everybody. And you've got to be proactive, and redundancy is critical because humans make mistakes. And it encompasses safe road users, increased safety in vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, in other words, designing the roads for what they're going to be doing, and of course, was something I never considered, post-crash care from 9/11, from 911. And that is it. That's my report. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. DeGan. Are there any questions from council members? And I would just second the safety report by Mr. Doctor. It's a great presentation, and it's on last month's tab agenda. It's probably worth taking a quick look at it. It was quite interesting. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we're on to our business items. Our first is consent business. There are 5 items on consent. If there are no objections to the consent agenda, I'd entertain a motion to approve the items on consent.
So moved.
Moved by Councilmember Gonzalez. Is there a second?
Fredson, second.
Second by Councilmember Fredson. Is there any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. And those items are approved. On to our non-consent business. The first item is business item 2022-92, which is Minnesota Transit Service Center lease extension. And we have Karen Davis here to present. Oh, Kevin, sorry. I have my CFAR glasses on, not the other ones, so I apologize. Thank you. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you. Good to see you, council members. My name is Kevin Davis. I am the supervisor of Metro Transit's retail service centers, and I'm here to talk about business item number 2022-92, that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute the 9th Amendment to continue contract number 16M167A with Equity Transwestern LLC for a 5-year lease extension of ground-level storefront space at 719 Marquette Avenue in Minneapolis to include rent and supplementary cleaning and maintenance costs. The total 5-year cost of this lease is $158,445. We've had a presence in this location for nearly 36 years. Our store is familiar with our customers. We provide a retail outlet and transit information to some of the most transit-dependent riders in our community. The service center is located near Nicollet Mall Station, many express bus stops, and an Orange Line BRT stop. This is a very natural fit for Metro Transit to have a retail location. We did consider other locations with the council's real estate department, and based on that analysis, we feel this price is fair. As a matter of fact, the negotiated price of $20 per square foot is down from the current rate of $24 per square foot. So with that, Madam Chair, council members, I will take any questions.
Good, thank you, Gavin, and apologize for the name, or saying your name wrong. All right, are there any questions from council members? Councilmember Gonzalez.
I was just wondering about the cost between continuing the lease and actually buying the location. Is that an issue under consideration, or would be any savings out of that?
Madam Chair, council members, I am not aware that any analysis was done on purchasing any real estate. As far as I know, we only considered the lease cost.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any additional questions or comments?
No.
All right. Seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2022-92.
So moved.
Moved by Councilmember Cummings,
Second.
seconded by Councilmember Fredson. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. And the motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, next we're on to our next business item, which is business item 2022-95, a same week item. It's asset condition assessment services. And we have Claudia Toussaint here to present.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, council members. This business item is to request that the council authorize the regional administrator to negotiate and execute contract 2022P111 with Guardian Group for condition assessment services in the amount not to exceed $594,686. This contract is to complete the preparatory work required by FTA regulations to complete the council's condition assessment asset management plan. The work under this contract is to complete condition assessments for the council's support, passenger, and parking facilities. Staff finds this proposal to be fair and reasonable and in the best interest of the council when compared with the request for proposal and the engineer's independent cost estimate. With this, Madam Chair, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the presenter? Councilmember Sterner.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering, can this be done internally, or does it need to be done with outside vendor?
To answer the question, yes. No, it cannot be done internally because we don't have the staff in place to do it. Other agencies do get this work done internally, but we are not good as of right now to do the condition assessments internally.
Okay.
Councilmember Sterner.
How many other bids do we have for this service at all?
The staff chose to do this contract under the Sourcewell Service Corporation. Sourcewell Service Corporation was created by Minnesota legislation, where government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and educational organizations can solicit work directly through the Sourcewell firm. Guardian, I must say, is a Sourcewell vendor, and they do go through the competitive bid process. And so we are able to solicit a contract directly from Sourcewell for doing that work.
Councilmember Sterner.
All right, just one final, then, have we worked with them on other projects before? They have what's their reputation and their?
My understanding is the council has worked with them. I have not worked with them personally, but the council has done work with Sourcewell.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any additional questions? All right, Councilmember Gonzalez.
Just a quick clarification. So this is for, what are the actual assets? Are those bus stations, repair facilities, all of the above?
Those are for support facilities, for example, our garages, our administrative buildings, passenger facilities, that would include our transit stations, transit centers, and rail platforms, and for parking facilities, which would include our structural parking facilities and also surface parking.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve business item 2022-95, same week.
So moved.
Moved by Councilmember Chambliss. Is there a second?
Second by Gonzalez.
Seconded by Gonzalez. Is there any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. With that, the motion's carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our actual business for the evening. So as for items that would move on consent, I would recommend, obviously, the consent agenda and our first business item. The second one being the same week item would move to the council as non-consent, if everyone agrees. Very good. All right, now we're on to our information item, which is the North Star Rail Corridor Post-Pandemic Study. We have Cole Henniker here to present.
All right.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cole Henniker, Multimodal Planning Manager for MTS. I have Steve Elmer here as well, who's sort of our day-to-day operations person for this project. So if there's any detailed questions here, should be able to answer towards the end. Leslie and Charles may also want to chime in. Because as you can see, this is a very important topic. We're here to talk about North Star. You're all probably aware that it's not performing quite as it did before the pandemic, and there's been a lot of pressure on us to look at what are we doing with North Star, what's the long-term outlook for this corridor moving forward. So we are going to be conducting a study. At this point, this study is meant to explore what it means to look at the future of North Star, some of the trade-offs that might be inherent in any decision we might make with North Star moving forward. So this is not a study to make recommendations. This is a study to provide agencies with information about the different trade-offs that are out there for decisions that could be made about North Star. So we're intending to bring information back to this group as well as our partners that help fund North Star once we conclude and develop all the information that the study is intended to produce. Some of the questions we're looking at, and you'll see this when we get into the specific tasks, are what are the trends in the corridor? What are some of their peer agencies thinking about when they look at their lines? You can imagine commuter rail is down all across the country, as is all transit services during the pandemic. What are some reasonable scenarios for what services could exist in this corridor to continue to serve the market in a meaningful way, and a different mix of services? And then if we implement any of those scenarios, what are the impacts to ridership, to costs? What are the funds that we'd have to put forth to pay off some of the assets we might have already invested in or acquire new assets? And then really important is what are some different impacts to socio-demographic groups? So this is where we'd start looking at things like equity, job access. How does this actually impact people along the line in the corridor and in these communities? So this is probably not a surprise to any of you all, but North Star, this is ridership all the way back to 2009 when the line opened. Kind of sounds crazy, right? 13 years ago. Of course, when it opened, it took a little bit of while to get started. It opened at the tail end of a recession, but we did see a fairly steady ridership growth right up until 2019 when we started to see overall transit ridership drop as well when gas prices dropped. But then, of course, there's a huge cliff that fell off at the beginning of the pandemic when North Star was cut back substantially. we had a peak of roughly 3,400 rides in 2017. We're down in the hundreds of daily rides during the pandemic. There was a slight recovery last year when numbers were low in the summer for COVID, but we've seen another drop again in the last few months, early months of 2022. So this is a pretty substantial drop, and it's not uncommon across the country to see this drop in ridership. You can see here some pure commuter rail lines across the country. This is about, I think it's 16 or so lines that we looked at. We were right in the middle of the pack of this set of commuter rail lines prior to the pandemic. And this is looking at 2019 ridership, daily ridership on the top bars, the blue bars, and then 2020 daily ridership in the red. So you can see a very substantial drop-off for Minneapolis, but a substantial drop-off for every commuter rail line in the country for the most part, at least the ones that we compared. We're not really comparing ourselves to systems like New York or Chicago. They're just at such a scale that it's not super helpful. But this is the percent of ridership when you're comparing 2019 to 2020, and this is where you can really see Minneapolis was at 20% of our pre-pandemic ridership when we compared 2020 to 2019, which is the lowest of all of those corridors in the country that we looked at. And we know that some of that is because a number of these corridors serve more of a passenger rail role. They're connecting maybe a college town to a larger area. And so this is an area we really need to dive into. One of our study tasks is to look more at what's happening at pure regions and why is North Star doing so differently than some of our pure corridors. So getting into the specifics of what are we going to look at through part of this study, or through this study. Number one, just acknowledging that we have a project management team. Metropolitan Transportation Services is going to manage this contract. As a long-range planning department at the Met Council, we do view this as a role that we can play an important role in facilitating between all the different stakeholders on the corridor. And really, it is a long-range planning idea here. We're not just looking at what's the short-term future of North Star. It's the 2040, 2050 vision for where we're headed. Our project management team does include staff from all of our partner agencies that provide operating funding for the corridor. So Metro Transit, MnDOT, NOCA, Hennepin, and Sherburne County are all funding partners and will all be participating in the project management team. That's important to have them, right at the forefront, since a lot of their boards are going to be weighing in on the ultimate the ultimate information that comes out of this study. We're also going to have a technical advisory group that will include the cities. So that will be where the cities will be engaged in this project, is a broader group, talk about things like where are their land use plans at, what commitments have they made, and how important is this corridor to their community. Another task that's really important is documenting the history of this corridor as well as the existing conditions. So as I said, North Star opened 13 years ago, and there was a lot of context as to why it was put into place, what some of the expectations were when it opened, and also a lot of commitments that were made both to the state and the federal government about how we're going to maintain this line and continue it operating. So we need to fully just kind of summarize all of that. A number of folks that were around when North Star was built are no longer with the agencies that they were with, so we need to make sure that we have a pretty complete picture of what the decision-making process around North Star was. We also want to make sure to understand where land use plans have been changed to try to take advantage of this corridor. So we know a lot of the cities have adopted land use plans that say we want to densify in this particular part of our city because of the existence of North Star. So we need to understand where those commitments have been made. And then, of course, review the performance of North Star under both pre-pandemic and pandemic conditions. As I said, we're going to do an assessment of pure region rail corridors, evaluating their performance both before and during the pandemic. You saw some kind of initial data there, but we'll dive into that in more detail. And really important here is that second task of conducting interviews with staff from these regions to understand how they're strategically thinking about poor performing rail lines that have a substantial capital commitment, but that really have a lot of uncertainty similar to North Star moving forward. So here's a few peer regions that we know have commuter rail lines that we may want to look at in more detail and possibly interview, but we'll narrow that down in consultation with the project partners and the consultant. This is one of the first of the meaty tasks of the study, which is to develop corridor service scenarios. And in our scope of work, we've identified creating up to 6 service scenarios that illustrate a different mix of investments including both bus and rail, and in some cases, a mix of both. Recognizing we may have bus service to certain stations and continue rail service to other stations. At a minimum, we will have a service scenario that includes replacing North Star with bus service entirely and looking at what those implications would be. We also anticipate having a scenario in which we continue to operate North Star at the pre-pandemic level and just see like what would that cost us in the long run, what are the expectations there. And then we figured there'd be a good opportunity to look at passenger service to St. Cloud. And this might come as a bit of a shock to you all. You'd say, why would you expand a route that's underperforming? And the thinking there is that if it's passenger rail, it really is a different service, a different market, potentially different funding mix, because we're talking about an intercity rail service as opposed to a commuter rail service. And so that opens up some potential opportunities if we look at that, and likely would have fewer trains, but a longer corridor overall. And so, you know, we did lay out some minimum service scenarios, but we wanted to identify up to 6 so that we could talk with the funding partners about what do they want to see evaluated as part of this study. And so that'll be a very important collaboration piece with those partners to look at how are we looking at this service, these service scenarios that meet their needs and that they want to look at. For task 5, and then of course we need to analyze what are the impacts of these scenarios. So evaluating both what's the near-term outlook for these type of scenarios and what's the long-term outlook, and compare the relative impacts of those scenarios. We have a couple of different categories of analysis that we anticipate doing. Financial, of course, is one of the most important. If we continue to operate North Star, it's going to have a certain amount of cost to do that, and basically into perpetuity. If we were to replace it with bus service, we know that we would likely save some operating dollars, but have to pay back potentially substantial amounts to, say, the federal government or the state government. So this would summarize all of those impacts for each scenario and look at compare them across the different scenarios. Of course, also looking at transportation impacts. What are the impacts to ridership? One of the initial justifications here was to relieve congestion. So what are the potential impacts that may have? And then, of course, land use is also really important, not just looking at what the plans are out there, but what has been happening in these communities. What would they do differently if North Star train were to be discontinued, for example, or if a different type of service were put in place? And of course, as I said, socio-demographic analysis, looking at, in particular, how does this impact those that are most dependent on transit, but also access to transit and opportunity, jobs and things like that, with the revised service plan. So we don't really have the specifics of all of these analysis factors because, again, we want to develop those in partnership with the corridor stakeholders. And so these are just broad categories that we're summarizing at this point for the scope of work. The tasks 6 and 7 are really the sort of deliverable, the package that they're going to give to us. The first is to create an evaluation tool to help us facilitate those discussions about how do we make a decision using the information that just came out of the previous tasks, and to simplify the really complex, detailed analysis into these considerations and trade-offs that policymakers and even the public can easily understand. What are we weighing when we're trying to make a decision about the future of North Star? And so it's to really digest it down into something that is easily presentable and able to be used with discussions with our partners and the public. And then, of course, producing study reports that document all of this in detail and make everyone that wants to look into the details aware of what those details are. And of course, study engagement, you all know this, our local governments are really engaged, particularly in transit corridors. This corridor is no different. Again, I want to emphasize this is not a study that has a decision-making process, so there isn't a board that's going to vote or a policy committee that's going to vote on this. It's just going to be engaged to make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do, and we'll have different levels of engagement. Policymakers will be engaged as needed essentially on a task basis. We envision engaging the funding partners when we start talking about which scenarios they want to explore, and then of course previewing them some of the technical analysis before all of this gets released publicly. And then we would also have that technical advisory group that includes corridor cities, and we expect them to meet more frequently throughout the study just to give us that set of eyes of expertise from local governments. So the schedule for this is, and I should note that we just received the RFP proposals on Friday, and so we're already in the procurement process. We anticipate kicking off in the next month and a half. And the first step is to develop all of information this summer on the background and start to develop those scenarios, and then really dive deep into the evaluation phase, which is typically the longest phase. Will likely take a few months to get through all that technical information. We anticipate having that results of that late this fall, probably November, December-ish timeframe, and then look at those final results leading into next year. The target date here is to really have some sort of sense for what the options are moving into the next legislative session next year. Not necessarily knowing, when we would need those, because session, of course, ebbs and flows, but having that information available so that we're more educated, and as a corridor, as a region, we can talk more about what this corridor needs in the long term moving forward. And so that's the target. It's a pretty aggressive schedule. All our partners are aware of it. We've already had conversation with those funding partners, and they're agreed to participate and help us along this path. So with that, I or any other experts in here will be happy to answer any questions you have. This is an exciting study. It's sort of a bittersweet a little bit, because we're looking at something that's not performing well, but I think we're doing the right thing by looking at it, and our partners agree with that. So happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Cole. Are there questions from council members? Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you for this report. So I'm curious about what the corridor funders have said. What are their feelings related to the underperformance, related to the need for the study, and have they said what they would like to see, or what they think what they might be anticipating could happen?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and I can certainly take that. And some of you who are in those meetings could also weigh in, but I think in general, people that have corridor partners have said that they like that we're doing this study. They think it's timely. They recognize that North Star isn't performing up to its standard. It really wasn't even performing up to its expectations before the pandemic. But I think that it's mixed in terms of where they want to head. A number of local governments still really talk about the value of North Star and the ability for them to focus growth in their community and really attract growth in their community. Others see the price tag and say, is this worth it? And I think those are the considerations we need to weigh. So I don't think luckily no one's mind is necessarily hard made up. And that's what we're hoping to inform with this analysis, is try to put some information behind some of those opinions that are already out there. I don't know if that is fairly accurate.
I think that is. Councilmember Zarin, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to weigh in and give a little comment. And North Star runs through my district, and predominantly the message that I get from my neighbors is they like having North Star there. They're not riding it, obviously, but they like having it there. They count on it for events, and whenever I talk about it, it's always the feedback from the constituents is very positive. The opinion of North Star is always been positive, and the comments keep coming about the twin service, right? Because folks really like to get on North Star for a Twins game and ride it back. And there's a lot of folks that have, they got season tickets because they knew they could ride that. And now, at this point, we've disappointed them. And I would hope that from this study we could find a way to satisfy those folks going forward. I guess there's no question there, but rather a context around it.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I know, and we know this from the studies, North Star, from the rider's perspective, is a very well-liked service. It is one of our highest, satisfactory services. So we definitely are aware of that, and that needs to be taken into context too, for sure.
Additional quick, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, are we doing constituent engagement, and how are we going to communicate this study process to them if we are?
Madam Chair, I think I can answer that, but I might want some help too. The initial thought was, because this is very fast-paced, we're going to do this in about 6 to 9 months, that we would develop all the information, then do the engagement once we have the information developed. So we're going to be doing stakeholder engagement with some of the key funding partners during this study, but the next phase about where do we go from here is when we start rolling it out more to the public with that information in hand. And so I think that has yet to be determined about how we would do that, and I think it's a part of what this consultant could recommend with that whole, package of tools that they give us is how do you roll this out to the public? How do you engage with both your stakeholders in hand to talk about what you're going to do with the public? But there isn't, as a part of the study directly, there is not a public engagement component of this piece. So we would kind of put that off till after the study is done.
Great question.
And I believe that there was some recent engagement done of riders, and there is a desire for ridership or for the service to be available, and it was still primarily for commuter services is what people were looking for. I don't know, Leslie, if you want to comment?
Chair Barber, yes, through the pandemic, we have reached out to people we know to be North Star riders to get a sense of the factors that would lead them to come back and so forth. And it's been a while since I've looked at those findings, so I don't want to try to quote them off the top of my head. But, in addition to the study work that's going on, certainly we're still interested in staying in touch with people who are current or perhaps lapsed North Star riders to keep them in.
And we can make sure that survey gets sent out to community members, just so for background, because I'm sure we'll have more conversations on North Star going forward. All right, additional questions? Councilmember Fredson and then Councilmember Cummings.
Thanks, Chair. I just had a follow-up on the twin service. I mean, that decision to reduce or stop service to Twins games in the evenings was based because Anoka County hasn't paid their portion of the service, right? Have they paid yet?
No, not at this point. The basic premise is what we're hearing from riders is that the commuter services is needed and that we are not able to add additional ridership, and we don't see it as prudent at this time to do that until the operating funds are paid.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Any additional? Councilmember Cummings and then Sterner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. I'm wondering, Mr. Hineker, if you, on slide 2, the rail average weekday ridership, it's an interesting pattern. What has analysis of that ridership shown? Are those spikes game days specifically, or is it just really that interesting a pattern of ridership?
Yeah, Madam Chair, and Leslie, or maybe Ed in here might weigh in, but I suspect it is based on those event-based spikes. But we can certainly get back to you with more detail, unless, Leslie, you want to weigh in on that.
I would, Chair Barber, I'd just add that our ridership generally is seasonal too, so I think we could look at specifically what might explain that pattern, but in addition to events, I'd also look at the seasonality of ridership generally.
If I recall, I think one of the other impacts with some of the spikes is when we have really bad weather. So, so that ties into it as well. All right, Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Second question. So once this package and study is completed, what's the time frame for analyzing all of this, going to the legislature, and what is their role ultimately in helping Metro make that decision on what will be done going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the time frame is timely because, as Councilmember Fredson acknowledged, we haven't been getting paid for this service. We do see, finances. We're sustainable through, I think, 2023 based on our revenues from federal government, but there's a certain time frame in which everything becomes, sort of a do we put it back in place or not question. So we're trying to get ahead of that with this study. I would say that we'll engage pretty heavily in the spring once we have results with the funding partners in particular, just to see where they're at. Anoka County in particular, who pays, I want to say 35% or so of the operating dollars. So we would engage immediately. I can't say for certain how that next step is going to look. I think we need to really get this information assembled and think about that from there. But I don't know if Charles or Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Council Member, it's really about preparing the information to then engage in the process of informed decision-making. So a lot of this is the information that then can assist the council and our partners in, really what that appropriate next step would be in also in engagement with the community.
Councilmember Cummings?
Just one little follow-up or clarification or whatever. So do you anticipate that when all this information is brought together that there may be sort of an a la carte option of, well, if we do this, it will cost that, and if we do this, and so that it can be pieced together by various stakeholders in different ways to come up with what serves the most for the least, or with the resources available? Or do you see coming up with just sort of a, here it is?
Right. Madam Chair, Councilmember Cummings, I don't envision it being quite a la carte the way you describe it. The scenarios will provide us with information about trade-offs that'll help us say, maybe more of this, less of this. I don't think we're going to necessarily commit to we're going to have the perfect set of solutions, but it might say, maybe bus service for this market is better than rail service, and that can save us money here. And then continued rail service in this market makes sense because it seems to be the most promising. So I think we'll have information to develop that a la carte options. I wouldn't say it's going to come directly out of this study, but it'll certainly help inform that in a great deal. And the biggest thing, of course, is if there's costs with a particular option, it'll give us more detail on what those costs would be, both short-term and long-term. And that's really the most meaningful part, is figuring out, what would the cost be and who has the money and is willing to pay for those costs.
I don't see, Director Carlson, you had a comment?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. And along those lines, I don't think it's, here's 6 scenarios, pick one. I think it's, here's the implications, as Cole's saying, cost and otherwise, of these different scenarios, and then it could likely lead to some hybrid of that, could be a hybrid of, components of them that's further developed and then enacted by the council.
Councilmember
One
Cummings?
final, I promise, it's my final. So the current agreement under which we are operating with the various counties contributing or not, that expires at the end, is it the end of 2022? Or, yes, okay. So I would think also that 2023, everyone will want to know what the next step is and where they fit in the overall picture.
And Madam Chair, I believe if it's not replaced by a new agreement, the current agreement would actually continue. So there is interest in evaluating this, but also, until replaced by a new agreement, the current agreement would continue. So it's not, that also informs our timing somewhat, that it doesn't have to be decided and enacted by the end of the year, but this information will be helpful as we continue to engage our partners.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sterner?
Yeah, thank you. And I think you might have said this already, but I just want to maybe try a question a little bit different. But do we know what riders are event riders versus the daily commuter riders? Is that available with it? Or is this what I'm looking at?
Sure, Madam Chair. I don't have that information in front of me, but it'll certainly be part of what we look at as part of that existing conditions analysis. I don't know if, Leslie, if you have anything off the top of your head. But.
Chair Barber, Councilmember Sterner, we can certainly look at what data we have and share with the committee. Yeah.
Okay, just maybe a couple more follow-ups.
Councilmember Sterner.
All right. So I'm looking at the St. Cloud option and that. Is there a rail bed that would go to St. Cloud from where, Big Lake to St. Cloud? Is that already built, easement or access to that?
Well, Madam Chair, Councilmember Sterner, we do have a lot of information luckily developed just recently by a MnDOT study that looked at what it would take to get North Star there. I think the considerations that they were looking at did require looking at, a certain number of trains, a certain frequency, and so they've developed options both on the capital side and, shared track rights and what that would cost, what it would look like. So we're going to essentially build off of what's already been studied. I don't have that information directly available right now, but it'll be a part of it, and MnDOT project manager is going to be on our PMT for that study, so he'll bring a lot of that expertise in terms of what the options are, and they've had a lot of conversations with BNSF about what the options might look like, and so that information luckily will help feed into this study in terms of what we can make assumptions about moving into St. Cloud. We're not, part of what allows us to do this a little bit quicker is because of the existence of that study, and so absent that study, we would have had to do a lot more analysis, you can imagine, on that piece, which isn't in place today. So that's a nice input into the study for sure. And I think that was completed in 2019, if I remember correctly.
Councilmember Sterner.
And then one is part of the study, we're looking at being creative with other funding partners, maybe some counties that are outside the 7-county area, maybe sports teams that could use it, maybe City of Minneapolis, business along the route. We look at some other kind of funding options.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Sterner, I think that is probably that sort of post-study look at what are the funding options for whatever scenario we come up with that we think is the most reasonable. There is a little bit of overlap when you say, if we're paying back, say, the federal government, there's probably limited sources that we can use to be able to do that, or paying back the state. So we will have to look at what sources could be used for the cost that we identify for all of the options. But I think the next step, if we say as a region, we think this is one or two of the best options, what are the right sources to deliver that option? Would be not part of this study, but part of the next phase once we narrow down those options. But I think the idea would certainly be to explore, and one of the reasons for looking at passenger rail to St. Cloud is we do believe it opens up more revenue opportunities with MnDOT and the larger pot of money for passenger rail, and potentially also saves us the need to pay back federal government. We haven't confirmed that yet, but there's some options there.
Okay, very good. Just maybe one more.
Councilmember Sterner.
Different gear, but as far as incidents on the North Star, since it's history, do you have an idea like what the percentage, or does it do better than some of the other lines like the green line or the blue line as far as safety, medical issues and crime kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't have that information, but we can certainly pull that together and we can do a follow-up with you in terms of how it compares.
All right, thank you.
All right, additional questions or comments from council members? Councilmember Gonzalez.
Just briefly, so just trying to see, is terminating all services one of the alternatives that might be considered? And, the trade-off of having to pay back the feds and some of the folks that already funded this thing compared to the savings, but also to the lost business opportunities of increasing development. So it's like, it sounds like that would be a complicated thing to analyze, but is that part of what you're trying to also figure out, if total termination will perhaps make more sense at the end of the day?
Madam Chair, council member, I think yes, it is one of the alternatives we want to look at. Whether we look at, is all service to these communities abruptly removed because of North Star, or do we replace it with some sort of parallel, complementary bus service? So I don't know that we've decided if one of those is what I would call the extreme option. Okay. Or if it's likely to be, if we do pull back North Star, do we reinstate some bus service to make sure those communities still have access to transit? But certainly one of the options on the table is pull out of North Star, see what the implications are, see what service we'd continue to run to serve those communities if we did that.
Thank you.
All right. Additional questions, comments? All right, and just a final one for me. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of this. I think the study is well thought out. I think it will give us a good holistic picture of how to make some decisions. I'm really excited to hear some of the information about the peer regions, both of how they responded to the pandemic and the changes and how they're coming back, and how we can consider some of that in our process. So, seeing no other questions, I'll say thank you, Cole.
Thank you.
Thanks. And so, committee members, that ends our business for tonight. I will tell you, it's very nice to be in person.